So thank you for having me. It's lovely to be back in person, and hello to people online as well. Um, so I wanted to think about how work that I've been doing over the past more than decade on crowdsourcing and volunteer engagement through online collections connects to the work that's emerging now more than ever with AI, and think about what we need in this moment and perhaps set some challenges for the sector. So to begin, hands up if you've tried an AI tool, and people online, you can post there as well and I'll look afterwards. Okay, quite a few people. Every time I've asked this over the year, the answer has changed. I think since ChatGPT launched late last year, the accessibility of AI to people has really, really increased and improved. So I'm curious to know, and it's hard to sort of get a sense in the room, but you can perhaps make a noise that sums up your experience. Did trying these tools get you more excited? Did it burst the bubble? Or are you somewhere in between, a kind of noise? A yay, a boo, or a hmm? 1, 2, 3, go. Mostly yay. Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Okay, and who has tried crowdsourcing either as a volunteer or within your organization? Just a show of hands. Okay, maybe half-ish. Right, thank you so much. Okay, my challenge is that GLAMs, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums should be using AI to enrich collections, but also to enrich online volunteering and forms of digital participation. We need to be very careful about how we use AI. The AI that we have now isn't necessarily fit for purpose, but it is increasing and improving all the time. So we need to be ready and making decisions now, improving our AI literacy now, so that we're able to implement these things as best as possible. One of the first questions I really want people to ask is, what do you mean by AI? It's a really crucial question. You might have noticed that increasingly you'll get an email saying, our product now includes AI. Well, what does that mean? Is it just a marketing buzzword? Does it just mean that you've bought a book on machine learning? Does it mean you're using ChatGPT to answer questions? What do you mean by AI? So what I mean by AI is twofold. Firstly, there's this sort of bright new future idea that computers will be able to emulate human thought, that they'll be able to think faster and better. I think a lot of that hype is oversold. When people give us that message of AI is dangerous, they're probably trying to sell us something. They're trying to hit our fear buttons, and it's always worth investigating why they're trying to trigger these really strong emotions in us, because they're trying to slip something past us, I think. So a lot of what we call AI is machine learning. It's mimicking human thought. It's nowhere near human thought. It's not thought. It's fancy predictive text. So it's built on machine learning algorithms. And for when I used to work as a programmer, and you had to kind of painstakingly set out the conditions under which different things would be taken or done. Machine learning, you don't have to write the algorithms. They are determined from the data itself. So the algorithms might look at a data set, or they might look at examples and build a statistical model that is an understanding of what that content is. And then they can use those statistical models to predict what the right answer might be. So it's kind of like a child guessing at the right words that they have to say to the biscuit. They're looking at your face to kind of see, are they on the right track? It doesn't mean they necessarily know that perhaps saying thank you or I'm sorry to the kid that they just hit is the right thing to do, but they know it's the right thing to say. And that's a really important difference. So these statistical models can be used to find patterns, to predict labels or classifications. Wonderfully, they can be used for transcriptions. They could be used for live translations. I've attended conferences in languages that I don't speak, because the live translation is good enough to kind of follow the content of the conference, which is incredible. They can be used to summarize existing content, and possibly increasingly people will use them to write long emails that someone else will then use a different AI to summarize the content of that email and write an email back to them. And why are we even in that process? And increasingly, we're also seeing generative uses of AI. So creating new images, new texts, videos by mimicking the kind of typical human outputs. So mostly at the moment we see these in large language models, LLMs. So ChatGPT, they're in Bing, they're in Bard. These are trained on huge quantities of scraped or acquired data. If you run or work in an institution with large collections of text or images, you might have been approached by some of these big companies looking to take in your data and use it to generate new language models. But it's important to remember that it is always just fancy predictive text. It's great at guessing which words will come next. If any of you work in any kind of reference services environment or in a research environment, or if you mark student work, you might have seen that these tools are fantastic at making up references. They'll include a DOI, they'll include a kind of vaguely plausible journal name or a book name. It's not based on any knowledge. It doesn't know anything about the world. There's no truth in what they're saying. It's just a statistically likely combination of words and characters strung together. One really great way of testing this is if you have an online presence, ask ChatGPT to write you a resume or a summary or a bio. You will sound amazing, but also your publications might not look quite right. So I work at the British Library. I've previously worked in many museums. I have some publications, according to ChatGPT, from the British Museum. It's put together these words to kind of make a likely thing. So these language models can't do maths. They don't understand truth, words, or concepts. So for those of you who've been in the sector for a long time, those conversations about the semantic web and linked open data, these aren't those. There are models that are looking to have a more semantic understanding of the world, but language models are just fancy text. And the image shows some of what ChatGPT have been trying to put in place to warn people about the limitations of their product. But it's quite easy to overlook that and get carried away. So image generation was the kind of the previous hot buzzword before ChatGPT launched. I love this image because it just kind of shows how they don't understand what the world is. I was doing a talk on for the Rare Books and Special Collections Society, love those guys, and I asked ChatGPT to give me an image of rare books, and it's kind of got the vibe. Like there's binding, there's sort of embossed lettering, there's pages, but it's not a book. It's just a book-like thing, and I think that really epitomizes what these models do and what they understand. I'll show you in a second something where there's the kind of typical thing of looking for extra fingers, looking at feet, looking at the slightly horrific faces. They are getting better all the time, and they can be used for misinformation. And for me at the British Library, I tend to work with pre-1900 collections, so they're kind of pure in the sense that there's no AI-generated material in them, but the web archive at the library inevitably will contain text generated by AI or machine learning and images and video and everything else. So our understanding of what's in our collections is being changed by these processes, as well as the pressure that it puts on understanding provenance and being wary about misinformation. And unfortunately, we're seeing that on social networks very much at the current moment. So thinking more positively, what can AI do for GLAMs? And Europeana has been doing a lot of work on this kind of idea of enriching cultural heritage data. So there's lots of experiments and early products that we're seeing transcribing text from images. So optical character recognition is improving all the time, optical layout recognition, transcribing text from audio. So there's quite probably online a live transcript option for this. I don't know how it's coping with the slightly odd Australian English accent, but they do get better all the time. Currently, there's a lot of work looking at multimodal items, so things that include both images and texts. And particularly if you think everything from illuminated manuscripts through to broadside ballads through to web archives, they're all multimodal items, and the thinking and the research is increasingly getting better at looking at how those items relate to each other. So as well as transcription, we have translation. We have a lot of work looking at objects and images, writing labels or descriptions. So Microsoft might offer to write a caption or an alt text for accessibility. in your Word document. You can upload your images to test sites and see how they deal with them. I've been quite surprised at how some of the commercial libraries that are really focused on like selling you a product can also understand like woodcuts and styles of illustration that aren't modern and aren't photographic, but the results are very variable. These AI tools can be great at detecting and linking entities, so people, places, dates, concepts. We're seeing lots of great work there, and again, you can try out these tools online. Just upload a document and see. Things like ANIF. I don't know if anyone's used that for automatically applying subject categories to texts, but that's a kind of cultural heritage design tool. And then really interesting things like clustering similar images and text, so building kind of these statistical models of vector spaces where you can find gorgeous work by Mario Kingman looking at images of fainting women on couches in 19th century novels. So he's kind of pulled all the images from the Flickr Commons collection into these looking for images that have similar styles and depict similar things. And you can also look for the similar words, which provides lots of opportunities for improving search and discoverability. And I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about a project called Living with Machines, which was a 5.5-year project at the British Library with the Alan Turing Institute and lots of partner universities. A huge, huge team was involved. So please do look at the links on the bottom so that you can see the really wide range of people who were involved. The links will be in the chat and to get a sense of the different kinds of strands of work that happened across the project, because I want to make sure that everyone gets the right credit. Broadly looking across the project, we used AI methods in many different ways. A lot of it was so AI that it's quite hard to pull out something and just say this is AI, because nearly everything was AI or machine learning or data science across the project. A lot of work with natural language processing and large language models. Not using ChatGPT in this case, but using an earlier language model called BERT, which was trained on 19th century digitized books to look at, to search for phrases and figurative speech within newspaper text, which you couldn't do with just a keyword search. There's really exciting work by colleagues looking at finding individuals between census years, so people's names change over the 10 years, particularly women, if they take a married name. Their occupation might change, their location might change, but trying to use kind of key aspects of the census records to find individuals over between the years at scale, so that they could look at things like how the introduction of the power loom changed the occupation of handloom weavers, who weren't called handloom weavers until the power loom came along. They were just weavers or loom workers, to see whether the power loom really did, how it affected that workforce, and at what point people sort of dropped out because the power loom was taking their work. So to answer these questions, they had to look at scale at census records, and they developed new methods to do this. A lot of linguistic research looking particularly at things like semantic shifts as words changed meaning over time. Building these vector space models and looking at how a word shifted in these models between decades, so that you could see how language reflected this period of rapid change as mechanization happened. And then some really exciting work looking at our large collection of digitized newspapers. The British Newspaper Archive contains about 60 million pages, just to give you a sense of the scale of material that we're working with. Comparing the digitized corpus available to researchers with what was known about the newspaper or media market at the time based on historical press directories. So looking to understand were liberal or conservative newspapers more likely to be digitized? And the digitization decisions relate to the use of newspapers in family history research. So the British Newspaper Archive focused on name-rich newspapers, where you're more likely to find the name of an ancestor. Those name-rich newspapers generally might trend towards, they're not the Times, they're not the super fancy newspapers, they're your local newspapers that have a bit more to say about ordinary people. So how do those decisions about name-rich newspapers affect the kinds of voices that are then found when you look at newspapers as a corpus for study? There's really exciting work using machine learning with computer vision models to read ordnance survey maps. So these are maps that across the UK show the extent of change as rural areas were urbanised, as people moved from the countries into the towns, and as things like the development of railway infrastructure changed the landscape across the UK. So colleagues like Katie McDonough have developed a model where humans can annotate patches of a map with features that they're interested in, and then the software knows how to look for those features across the wider range of maps across the UK, so you can scale up those kinds of inquiries. And this has actually been adopted by scientists in other fields because that model of annotating visual features is very generalizable. So it's fantastic work coming out of the project. And even really sort of foundational things like using machine learning to improve fuzzy search when we have bad OCR. A lot of the OCR that we worked with dates back over 20 years, so it's really poor quality compared to what you get now. So this kind of works around the fact that string keyword searches weren't very effective when you've got sort of line noise style transcriptions rather than the high quality transcriptions that we're getting used to now. And I wanted to take a moment to think about how we use community participation in this project. And this is, in a way, going back to work I've done over quite some time now, broadly positioning crowdsourcing. So this idea of tasks that need to be done that are shared with the public as a framework for productivity and for engagement. So this is a screenshot from a project working with historical playbills, which are kind of flyers for upcoming theatre performances, or in this case, a broader description of a theatrical work. Half of the interface is about distracting people from the task. I really wanted people to have support for any moments of curiosity. I wanted them to think about what they were seeing, to wonder, like, who is this performer? What was this event that they're talking about? Why are there so many dogs in lion costumes? Anything. So some of the transcribe the title part of this is about getting people to actually do the work, and the other parts are about download the data and explore it for yourself, talk about it on a forum, view the playbill in the original context in the volume, look at the metadata, look at the wider collection records. So it's really thinking about crowdsourcing both as a way of getting, at this point, text that was hard to get with transcription tools, but also encouraging people to look at collections they might not otherwise feel a connection to. These are really fragile items. They were ephemeral. They were printed on cheap paper. They weren't designed to be kept compared to. So this is a way of getting people to feel that they had something to say about this collection, that they might be too scared to get a reading room pass because it's a whole process. You have to be in London. You have to feel a bit fancy about doing that. I wanted to put this work right out in front of people and to say, if you've got 5 minutes and you want to distract yourself, then do this task. Building on that, we made sure that crowdsourcing was included in the Living with Machines project right from the start. But our goal was really to think about how crowdsourcing needed to change to meet the challenges of the AI and machine learning. Part of this was building on the interest that people have in old newspapers, knowing that people who come in to use newspapers for research often get distracted by the stories that they find about other things, but also building on people's curiosity about machine learning and data science. So participants in these projects on Zooniverse could see how they were creating data sets that could be used to train machine learning models. So we were demonstrating and letting people participate in the process of creating material for machine learning. because I think a lot of AI hype overlooks the fact that AI is built on people. It's people annotating, classifying, doing the work of adding some structure and information to material, or people moderating. But machine learning is always built on people to one extent or another. So it's a chance for people to actually see that in practice. Through the project, we found that there are tensions between people who are used to the idea that you can just like throw work over the fence and pay someone to do it, when we were looking at things like how could we design for engagement, for curiosity, versus that ability to be to predict, to say the crowd will have done this in a week. And a lot of this work was done during the lockdowns. So when people were locked down or the weather was miserable, lots of work happened. As soon as people could get outside again, they ran outside. So work would slow down. It was a very kind of human rhythm. It very much reflected the moment we were in. So our goal was to kind of build a system that integrated the work of people with machines, having people classify material, training a machine learning model, and then having people rate the work of the machine. We didn't quite have the resources to do all of that, but luckily the Library of Congress did. So they did a pilot project looking at how machines could assist the work of getting material from newspaper telephone directories. This is the kind of task that I would never do as a crowdsourcing project because it's really boring. Like, newspaper articles are one thing because there's always something interesting happening, even if it's not in the article that you're looking at. You can see those other articles and be like, ooh. Telephone directories, not so much. So it's the kind of project that's perfect to bring machines into because they can do the boring work, leaving people to do the fun work. So have a look at the Library of Congress report. It still requires a lot of work to set this up at the moment, and that's one of the challenges that I wanted to bring into the room today. As these systems get easier to build, we need to think about how we're round tripping, how we're building for collection systems that are a bit more malleable, a bit more flexible, more and better able to take in material from different sources, from the crowd, from Wikidata, from machine learning, and whatever else. So we can do all these amazing, amazing things. We can classify things until the cows come home, but can your catalog support this data? Really tempted to start a fight between archivists and librarians about who has better systems for recording things flexibly. We heard yesterday in one of the workshops how bad a system like MARC is that was designed for the 1970s. Our catalogs don't reflect our current times. The models that they have are based on an era when we had a bit more human time, different ideas of authority. So AI and crowdsourced data, they don't really get along with collections management systems. So can you store the enriched data in your catalog, or does it sit in some other system alongside things? Can you ask the community to comment on your collections? Can you get living memories about your collections from members of your community, from the diaspora, from original source communities? Or does that sit with the community engagement officer who might leave because they're probably underfunded? Can you build better amazing abilities to search by, to expand keywords into related concepts? But do they fit into your little horrible narrow search box, or do you have two different systems that people are somehow meant to know about? If you do incorporate machine generated enrichments, guesses at the objects depicted in things, entities, can you give a confidence score to show people, we're 99% confident that this is a good keyword, or this is in the 60 to 80% range, so it might be useful, but we're not saying that we think it's perfect. That's a really important kind of in terms of the transparency, in terms of literacy, in terms of confidence in collections, in the interfaces that we use to provide access to our collections. So a really boring point, but it's really important. You can't do any of this if you haven't digitized material. You can do some interesting things with metadata, but without digitization, what is the machine going to look at? And it's really boring. It costs money, it takes time, it's hard to do well, but it is what it is. And another point is that putting things into cloud storage so that you can run these compute processes can get very expensive if your images are hopefully large and wonderful. Because cloud storage next to compute is expensive. And again, that's a really boring practical note. But it's one of those things that I want funders to hear, I want CEOs to hear. You need to plan for these kinds of aspects as well. So just a little side note on why we need to be careful about AI. And I think over the conference, we're going to hear a lot about people's experiments with AI, with things that they've tried, with the kinds of the caveats. The UK has an AI safety summit coming up, and I'm hoping that they'll bring these kinds of points into it. So AI is not intelligent. It's not conscious. Some of the tools like ChatGPT, it has this cute thing where it pretends to be thinking like it does ... ChatGPT is typing. No, it is not. That's just, it's faking it. It's making, we're really, as humans, we connect to things, we see patterns in things, we see faces in things. Don't fall for that in ChatGPT and other things. It's not conscious. It doesn't think. It doesn't have a self. Sadly, it's also not a magic wand. It probably won't cope with your messy data. Again, increasingly, it's getting better, but your data is not what these systems were designed for. And it might not be the right solution for what you're trying to do, but it might get you money to do the thing that you want to do, or resources to do the thing that you want to do. So just sprinkle it in if you need to, but be careful. Okay, so LLMs are what we have. They're not really what we need. And, you know, life is what it is, so we work with what we have. It's not safe to use ChatGPT for any vital task. This is a great flowchart that you can use to think about when you can use it. I'd say generally we're not in a position to be able to use it unless it's very heavily caveated. And one of the reasons for this is AI, I love this quote, it tends to sand away the unusual because it's based on probabilities, because it's based on, am I going to get the biscuit if I say the right thing? It's not going to say the unusual but correct thing. So if you're using it with your collections, it's probably going to give you quite bland, useful, but bland information. So you still want that really specialist attention. And I think that's where things like crowdsourcing can come in, because you can challenge people to say something more than the machine has said. And I think this question will come up later in at least one of the panels. I mentioned that you can get some horrific faces. There's a case at the moment, Getty Images versus Stability AI. The machine learning models aren't meant to retain the material that they've been trained on, but you can see that it kind of lurks in there. It's really hard to remove things from these models. So if you train a model on a scientific paper that is then retracted, that incorrect information might stay in the model, lurking in there, waiting to come out at some time. And I think there are really big ethical questions that we have to think about, as well as legal challenges about what generative AI means for people who create for a living in one way or another, and for GLAMs as custodians of that information. Really quickly, what major life event is being depicted here in all these images? Any guesses? Wedding, yeah, okay. So one is an Edwardian wedding, one is Nigerian, one is Chinese, one is Indian. They're not necessarily picked up by all machine learning algorithms, because if they've been trained to expect a big white meringue dress, that's what they think a wedding is. So it's really important that the tools that we work with have the fullest, richest understanding of what human life is now and has been over the past. Because otherwise they cannot describe our collections, they cannot represent the richness of our collections. Okay. So the challenge really is, AI going to destroy crowdsourcings, or can we make decisions to enhance it? For the past almost 10 years, I've been worrying about the fact that AI can do many of the tasks that are the beginner tasks in crowdsourcing. So people love transcribing handwritten text. It represents the kind of the trace of an actual human hand. It connects you intimately to the person who wrote that text. You can trace over their words. It's also an enjoyable puzzle because we don't deal with handwriting a lot. And people love things like and classifying pictures, identifying, counting the penguins in a Zooniverse image, or identifying elements in a painting. Crowdsourcing these puzzle-like tasks were fantastic ways to invite people into cultural heritage collections. You didn't need to be fancy, you didn't need to have a history background, you just needed to recognize a jug and an apple in a still life. But now that AI can do a lot of these tasks, we need to think about how we're inviting people in. Because the thing I love about crowdsourcing is that you don't need to be fancy to do it. You don't need to go to the reading room. You don't need to be able to nod with your hand on a tin. You can just type what you see. So how do we build these systems? So I want to really rethink crowdsourcing as a form of volunteer enrichment. So crowdsourcing can enrich collections, machine learning can enrich collections. Together they can create a much better volunteer experience. They can automate the boring stuff. They can also improve the experience of staff in institutions. One of the big barriers to crowdsourcing has been worries about quality control. So I think there's conversations to have about what data quality means in your context, but also when can volunteers review text or review classifications that are in front of them and say yes or no. And there's some really lovely metaphors and interfaces for doing this kind of work that mean that you don't have to have your staff with deep expertise doing that work. They can do more involved, more expert tasks. And also these really boring tasks like getting structured data from a telephone directory. Very few people are going to want to sit there and do that, or look at a train timetable, or any of these wonderful historical sources that can generate incredible amounts of rich data for use in study. But with machine learning, we can do that. So let AI do the boring stuff. Redesign workflows for the benefit of both staff and for volunteers, which also means rethinking authority and building for round tripping. So I've worked in cultural heritage data for a long time. I've released data sets, and you release a data set and immediately people clean it up and they send it back to you and you're like, this is fantastic. You've tidied up all the inconsistencies, but I have no way of getting this back into our collection system. Even more now with things like Wikidata, we could release a collection through Wikidata. People might enrich it, add to it, and then we can't bring it back into the collection system. So we really need systems that can do this round tripping. We need to think about where imperfect data is better than no data at all. And as I said, think about not only how could these AI machine learning systems improve work for staff, but also how do we involve staff in making these decisions? We don't want people feeling anxious about their jobs being taken. We went through that with the Industrial Revolution. We don't need to do that again. So let's work with staff to devise these systems. And my final rant against Mark is that thinking about the fact that digital objects, they're not just surrogates. We're here, Europeana has been here for years. Digital objects have a life of their own, they have value of their own. They need records that aren't just about something hanging off the main record. We still think about the main record and the digital record. We need to think more holistically about these systems. So I think modern collection management systems should think about digital objects alongside the physical object. They should allow for these different forms of enrichment so that we can move from the 1970s through to the 2020s. Thank you for listening, and I'm glad to take any questions.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Mia. My favorite quote that I will completely take out of context is AI, just sprinkle it in. I love that one. But maybe the context is important there when it came to funding. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm here to facilitate your questions online as well. If you have any questions, there should be a Q&A function in Venulus. Do be aware that there is quite a delay between what's happening in the room for real and in Venulus. So if your questions online aren't immediately answered, that's probably because we have some delay to getting your questions. But I'll first open it up to the room. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask Mia? We have one in the front here. I don't know if we have the catch box ready. Yes. This is a very Dutch thing. Something will be thrown at you. You will have to catch it and speak into it. This is our microphone.
Yeah.
Lovely. Go ahead.
I'm Dutch, so I'm used to it.
Perfect.
Thank you. Fascinating. Yeah, I wondered often, I think, as you said, you get these pipelines with AI and human in the loop, and then maybe repeat that a couple of times. So I was wondering, I'm working on HDR. Of course, there is entity recognition. Maybe also you want to link it, identify the people, as you said, also in some of the examples. I was wondering, do you have any advice from your projects where to put the human in the loop? Do you do it in every phase, also to make the AI of the different steps better and better? Or do you do it only in the end to get the best output? And I think this is then also something, again, to get into the system and show on the website as well, that it's not just a number for the prediction, but the whole loop of steps where sometimes it gets it right or somewhere in the loop it goes wrong.
Okay, thank you. So for your handwritten text recognition, are you using Transcribus? Or
Partly, and
yeah.
also open source variants.
Okay. So Transcribus, for people who haven't seen it, is a platform, a tool that uses machine learning models to improve recognition for handwritten text. As I understand it, improvements made there do go back into the model, or you can take a base model and develop your own, train it. So I think in that case, the distance between the human and the computer, it's quite a tight loop. In crowdsourcing and online volunteering, there's this idea of no unnecessary clicks. So you don't want people to do work that might not go anywhere. So I think the context is always different, but if you're asking people to judge the work of machines or to do work that becomes the basis of a training model, you want to put that at the points where it can have the most impact, and that will partly depend on the kinds of models that you're building and what they're good at, and how they fit into your workflows. So it's hard to kind of give a definitive answer, but thinking, I mean, ideally piloting and kind of testing and thinking about, are you getting the results that you expect from the models that you're developing? Can you tweak where different things happen so that you're getting the most value from the human review? I wouldn't have thought that you'd want more than one loop, unless for any given item, but ideally a kind of reinforcing system where it's learning all the time. I think Zooniverse are building some things like that, so it might be worth talking to their technical people about how they're making decisions about their architectures. But I think as we get more people doing this work, there are more people to ask these sort of specific implementation questions, because hopefully we're developing expertise as a sector that we can share with each other. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. Do we have another question in the room? Then you have the great honor to throw your catch box to the man behind you, and maybe you can stand up, sir.
I'm Chris Dijkstorm from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I did some crowdsourcing projects like 10 years ago. And actually, it got me in a quite cynical mode because of the amount of resources you need to sort of set up infrastructure, set up the projects, actually make the community work. And I think this will be actually a higher effort in incorporating the AI. And I was just curious, is this progressing a bit in the amount of effort that institutions need to really incorporate this? Because AI doing the round tripping, it feels like even more infrastructure that I have to take care of. Is there progress in that area?
Yeah, so thank you. I had a slide that I didn't include in the main part, but I work with Zooniverse to build functions to start projects from a AAAF manifest. So AAAF, the International Image Interoperability Format, some combination of those I's, produces a manifest, which is a JSON file that kind of provides all the metadata around images. And if you have a manifest, then you can start a project on Zooniverse. And that was designed around the fact that it's really hard to like move images en masse, to think about storage, to think about keeping the metadata with them. So this takes advantage of the fact that AAAF is about taking the metadata with the image. And then you can get the results back as an annotated either canvas for individual items or as a manifest or as a Zooniverse data set. And that's partly addressing the fact that there's an overhead. And the question of like how, if you have limited resources, how you use them, partly comes back to your mission. So for the British Library, our mission is that our collections are for research, education and enjoyment. And I've kind of leaned into the research and enjoyment part of that because I think collections come alive when people look at them. And I think crowdsourcing has a really valuable role to play in giving people a wider sense of the past. So for me, it ties into that part of our mission, as well as producing useful data when things like it's still even not quite possible for the playbills to get structured data about things like titles. We can read the text, but we can't say these are the actors, this is the title, but we'll get to that point. So it does depend on what's important to your organization, but workflows are getting easier to manage, and depending where things like data space conversations go, it might not be that you need to build things. It might be that you just need to get your records into a point where someone else can build things. But then again, that round tripping becomes really important. And I think that's probably the key at the moment is how do you take in enriched data from elsewhere, no matter if it's come from from volunteers or from AI. You can do amazing, amazing things, but if you can't get it back into your catalog, then, where is the investment worth it? So I think taking a look at what we can do now in 2023 and what might be possible in the near future, but also thinking about is your institution prepared for the technical and the cultural challenges of round-tripping data? So yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you. Very good question. We have time for a few more questions. I will first ask one from online. So thank you to the person who asked this in Venuless. They say, thank you for your nice presentation. You mentioned a part about engagement. It would be great if you could enlighten us a little bit more about the immersion and immersive technologies part in cultural heritage institutions, particularly for community engagement in GLAMs.
Okay. So it's hard to know what immersion means in this context. I don't do anything like VR, AR-ish because I'm cynical about how much time I would personally spend with some greasy headset strapped to my face. But
Fair.
for me, the real immersion comes in you're reading something and your mind goes a million different places. Or you look up and an hour has passed and you've been watching something or reading something or looking at a piece of art. A lot of my thinking about engagement comes from museum studies, looking at this idea that you can walk through a gallery in a couple of seconds and each painting gets like a look out of the corner of your eye. But if you're asked to tag an image, you're suddenly really engaged with it. And when I was working at the Science Museum, I accidentally got my art historian friends interested in the history of science because I asked them to tag scientific images. And that was the first moment when I was like, hang on, there's something in this close looking. There's something about being asked to say something about the thing in front of you that changes your relationship with it, that makes it active. So for me, that's the engagement aspect. It's looking and it's asking questions and it's being part of a community that all thinks that looking at things is worthwhile.
Thank you. I love the point about the immersion that text can also give, or just audio or video, and it not always having to be your headset or your VR headset. I thought we had one more question in the back. Oh, is that me? It might be, sorry. Can the catch box be delivered to you? Yes, and please stand up while you ask your question if possible. Thank you.
Hi Mia, thanks for the great presentation. So my question is about your note on transparency of data provenance and uncertainty. Do you have any good examples of user interfaces or user experience around that? In particular, because we've looked for it and shied away from doing it, just the clutter of the information about something that is trying to quantify something which is ultimately very subjective, and it's up to the user to understand whether the data is valuable to them for their current need, and a number associated with every piece of data can become quite challenging.
Yeah,
So,
thanks, Rob.
yep.
Luckily, I do have an example. The National Archives in the UK did some work looking at, so the National Archives in the UK is government records. So they had a lot of records about soldiers in the First World War, and different data sets. So enlistment, medical treatments, troop movements, whatever, pension records, medals. They used machine learning to try and link these records. So Bob Smith, or someone with a more unusual name, Peter Winterbottom. Some people are easier to find in these records than others, and maybe descriptions or birth dates or places of birth. Like sometimes these bits of information shift, and a historian or someone looking at these records manually can make a good guess about whether someone's the right match. They experimented with how to label the certainty. So they came up with human translations. They labeled the link to possible objects as being done by a machine, but they also said something like very likely or could be or whatever. So they translated the statistical confidence rating of the machine learning match into something that people could understand. So if it gave you a chance to think about whether you wanted to invest time in looking at that record that might be a match or might not be. And that was really based on their understanding of how people use those records. If you're doing something like object detection, you might want to be really confident in saying that here are all the fantastic medieval knights versus snails battles in the margins of manuscripts. So if you want people to only have a high quality experience, you might set a really high bar for knights versus snails. But if you want them to find anything that looks like a snail, which the depiction's got a bit sketchy, then you might let people go for a lower confidence rating. So I think it's partly about building in these features into the display on the page, not going into an advanced search form, but things like faceting and filtering, and probably looking at e-commerce. Not Amazon and sites like that because they're just a mess at the moment, but maybe that's a chance for cultural organizations to lead the way in building interfaces that help people find a way through, I'm desperate for any medieval snails versus I only want definite snails.
Thank you. Very good question as well. That's all the time we have for questions, I'm afraid. But once again, let's give a warm hand to Mia Ridge for your lovely opening keynote.